The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power Season 1 finale has dropped, bringing a conclusion to the first season of this big epic show. And the question is, was it a satisfying conclusion or was it something disappointing? In a show that is so heavily built around mystery box storytelling or follow the next clue type of storytelling, I feel like one's enjoyment of the overall experience is going to be affected pretty heavily on what they feel about the reveals that are given in this episode. And for me and where I'm coming from, I would say that this season finale was just a bit disappointing. And where I want to talk about why I think this kind of falls flat for me comes in three major areas. Number one, was the reveal of Sauron something satisfying or not? Number two, what was the purpose of the Harfoots in this series to this point? And number three, did they properly execute the moment of the crafting of the Rings of Power? Now, throughout this review of the finale, I will have spoilers for the entire series up to this point. So if you haven't caught everything, this is your spoiler warning. I will be spoiling any and all things that happened in this show to this point. So let's talk about the first thing I want to discuss in this review. Was the Sauron reveal satisfying? This episode was marketed to be when evil reveals itself. The show up to this point has very much been revolving around the Sauron reveal, or where is Sauron, probably more than who is Sauron. And so whether or not this was an enjoyable first season depended on whether or not you were going to like the big reveal that Halbrand is Sauron. Now, they did try to do a little bit of a fake out in this episode by making you think that it could possibly be the stranger, but the way in which it all went down, I think most viewers probably were not faked out and probably thought, yeah, no, at this point the stranger is not Sauron, so it must definitely be someone in Eregion. And then, of course, it turned out to be Halbrand, which for me was probably the person in the show that I wanted it to be least, if I'm going to be completely honest. And I think part of that is because internally the storytelling of the show has some major plot holes, with that being a reality, as well as it is a pretty big break from Tolkien's lore and the timeline of the Second Age. And while I've tried to put my purist Tolkien mind aside for this show, sometimes it's really hard when they do things that are very impactful for the overarching story of Lord of the Rings in this way. And here's where I'm getting at. Essentially, this show is built around Galadriel and Halbrand meeting in the middle of the ocean in a massive Deus Ex Machina event, and it brings down and boils down the creation of the Rings of Power and the One Ring to kind of be this ill-fated moment that happens between Galadriel and Sauron, rather than it actually being the craftiness and planning of Sauron himself. It seems to be just a mere coincidence that he decides to change his mind and start pursuing evil once again, and I feel like that's what I am thinking when I find out that Halbrand is Sauron, and for me, that's pretty disappointing. For me, I would have much preferred to have seen Anatar manipulating Celebrimbor behind the scenes and seeing how the show does that, rather than trying to make this whole entire thing a mystery, and then it ends up being the person who I just really didn't want it to be. I feel like there are going to be people who like this reveal, and there are definitely moments where the execution is pretty cool, right? They make Halbrand to be this sympathetic villain and making it as if his fall to evil is more of a complex thing than this complete he's always been bad and he's irredeemable. He's definitely portrayed as a character who has his own philosophy of peace, making him a villain who has somewhat of an ideology that could pass as something that has good intent, but ultimately he is the villain. He's evil. He's not reliable in what he says. He's deceptive. And I think that's what makes this interaction between Halbrand and Galadriel when the reveal happens somewhat compelling. There's some pretty cool shots that you get with Halbrand and Galadriel on the raft. The whole Mirror of Galadriel sequence that plays out there on the ocean is very cool looking, but this reveal just really didn't land for me. And a lot of it has to do because of the grander implications it has on the creation of the Rings of Power and the One Ring. It's like the perfect coincidence that the One Ring and the Rings of Power are both crafted because these two fatefully met in the middle of the ocean. And to this point, I haven't complained too much about lore changes, but when you're impacting the lore in such a significant way, that's a pretty big leap for the showrunners and creators of this show to take, in my personal opinion. So yes, the Sauron reveal was the first thing in this episode that kind of disappointed me, but the other thing that happens in this episode is we get a bunch of Harfoot action, and to be completely honest, I feel like the Harfoots pacing has been, not terrible throughout the show. It's just they feel like they don't fit within the story. And this episode doesn't really make much of a case for them needing to be in this story. By the time we get the fake out that the stranger actually isn't Sauron, he's actually a wizard and Istari, they want you to think that it is Gandalf. It might be Gandalf. It might be a different wizard. Who knows? It seemed like they were trying to obviously lead that Halbrand was Sauron from about episode 5 moving forward, and it seemed a bit too obvious at that point. And at this point, for the stranger to be Gandalf seems a bit too obvious, so who knows? Maybe it's another really obvious upcoming reveal, but as far as the lore goes, Gandalf wasn't in the story at this period in time, but from what we've learned about this show, they just don't really care about whether or not it's in the timeline. They're willing to read in between the lines in very large ways. So with that being said, I feel like this sequence was at least somewhat entertaining, but by the time that you get to the end of Nori deciding to leave the Harfoots and go adventure with the stranger, they still haven't been tied into the grander narrative. At least all of the other perspectives were, but the Harfoots haven't been to this point. So to be completely honest, this came across to me as the Harfoots being simply fan service for people who are familiar with Lord of the Rings. People are familiar with having hobbits as the main characters in their stories, so then they add Harfoots in the Second Age as a fan service type of thing. And because people are used to big, powerful wizards being part of the story in Lord of the Rings, they did that in the Harfoots' perspective, and it does come across as fan service from my point of view, even though I feel like there are thematic parallels between Nori deciding to leave her family and adventure and Galadriel needing to give up what she was letting go of and make a sacrifice in order to do what is right. There are parallels between those two heroines. You can see how one is like the other, and I think that's really the only relation that these two major narratives have. Outside of that, the two stories haven't really been intertwined with one another, and that felt like a bit of a letdown. It makes it feel like the Harfoots were just there to be strictly a side story. Now, with it being a long-running television series, of course, they can work them into the major plot by the time you get to the end of the show, but we've been going with this for a long way for them to not have integrated them within the major narrative to this point. And then lastly, I want to talk about the crafting of the Rings of Power. This is the title of the show, The Rings of Power, so you're really hoping that they can nail this moment right. And if I'm going to be completely honest, we've got all of these journeys and things happening within the show that are non-canonical, like Galadriel going to Numenor, Elrond and Durin having their political agreements and what they're going to do with the Mithril and the Blight and all of these things. And the one canonical moment that they do have is the crafting of the Rings of Power and Sauron deceiving Celebrimbor in order to get him to make the other rings, and I feel like all of this was brushed over extremely fast in a way that, even though I thought it was decent in the acting and the performances in this moment between Halbrand and Celebrimbor are actually pretty good, and the person who plays Celebrimbor does a very good job. But this is a very important moment within the series, within the show, within the lore, that it seems like they want to just fit in within this finale to kind of say, hey, we did something that was in Tolkien, we're going to get it in here. And I thought that the execution was fine, but not good enough from my perspective. I would have liked for them to actually have had some Annatar deceiving Celebrimbor. Now, that's something that they can do via flashbacks, or maybe they're messing with the timeline a little bit at this point as they go forward with the show. You know, that's one thing that is nice about television, is that you can kind of retrofit ways in which you can fix plot holes from earlier story developments as the story goes on. But there were just some things that happened here where I felt, man, that felt rushed. It felt like this is what the show should have been paying attention to rather than other things throughout the first season. Like, I'm glad we at least got this, but at the very same time, it felt a bit unsatisfying. It felt really rushed, and it didn't feel nearly as epic, as big, or as grand as I thought it would be, right? And it all ties around to this other moment within the show that's not canonical, with Finrod and his dagger and Galadriel needing to let go of the past, which again kind of comes across as the showrunners really not trusting the source material and having to do conventional type of modern TV storytelling types of MacGuffin things, and I just didn't love that. And so as these three things played out, I walked away from the finale feeling, that was a bit disappointing. In a season of television that has been marketed as this huge, big budget production with all of these beautiful places and shots and things that we've seen on TV, it feels like for the most part, the storytelling and the characters are pretty shallow and barely meet the bar of average. And I would say that as far as storytelling and performance and all of that goes, like, the show is average. It is okay. It's fine. But to say it's anything beyond that is, I think, giving the show a little bit more credit than it deserves. And when you have this type of budget and this type of money and this type of name, it feels like just being okay or just being average isn't quite good enough. And no, it's not because I wanted more action or battles or anything like that, but more tension within the storytelling, better setup and payoff, less convenient style storytelling, and more logically based storytelling. These are the types of things that I think make good television shows, and absolutely better character development. I feel like the character development in this show was all over the place. And I do have a video that I'll be making here in a few days about my overall perspectives of the entire season, what I thought of the story, the characters, the production quality, all of that is coming. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to check that out. Thank you so much for checking out this review and all of the ones leading up to this point. It has been a joy to talk about this show. Sometimes I've had a lot more fun talking about it than watching it, and I appreciate all of you who've checked these things out. If you've enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and tell all your friends about Parallel Quest, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.